Sometimes the greatest abuse of power begins with the smallest assumption. On a quiet Saturday morning in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia, the air carried the comforting scent of freshly cut grass, and the neighborhood seemed untouched by urgency. Children laughed somewhere beyond the tree-lined sidewalks. Sprinklers swept across emerald lawns in slow, rhythmic arcs, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves while walking their dogs beneath a clear blue sky. It looked like the kind of place where everyone recognized one another, where front porches represented peace instead of suspicion. Sitting comfortably in a weathered wooden rocking chair on the porch of a modest brick home was Daniel Brooks, a 54-year-old black man whose calm demeanor blended naturally into the peaceful scene around him. A ceramic mug of coffee rested on the small table beside him, while an open legal journal lay across his lap. Every few moments, he lifted his eyes from the page, quietly appreciating the gentle breeze that rustled the American flag hanging beside his front door. To anyone driving past, Daniel appeared to be exactly what he was, a homeowner enjoying a slow weekend morning on his own property. Yet only a handful of people in the entire neighborhood truly understood the weight of the responsibilities he carried every weekday. That morning, however, none of those responsibilities mattered. For the first time in weeks, his phone remained silent. His calendar was clear until early afternoon, and he intended to enjoy every peaceful minute before leaving for an important engagement later that day. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson tended to her flower beds while occasionally glancing toward Daniel with a warm smile. The retired schoolteacher had lived there for nearly 30 years and knew him as the polite gentleman who always shoveled snow for elderly neighbors during the winter and helped organize community food drives every Thanksgiving. 2 houses down, 12-year-old Mason Parker rode his bicycle in careful circles along the sidewalk, occasionally raising a hand to wave at Daniel, who always answered with the same quiet smile. Everything about the morning reflected normal life, the kind of ordinary moment most people never stop to appreciate until it disappears. Then, without warning, the peaceful rhythm was interrupted by the slow approach of a black and white patrol vehicle rolling into the cul-de-sac. Its tires barely made a sound as it stopped directly in front of Daniel's home. Officer Ethan Walker stepped out, adjusting the radio clipped to his shoulder while scanning the property with narrowed eyes. He didn't wave. He didn't greet anyone. Instead, his attention locked immediately onto the man sitting calmly on the porch. Daniel looked up from his coffee, meeting the officer's stare with quiet curiosity rather than concern. He had no reason to feel alarmed. He was at home, on his own property, doing nothing unusual. But assumptions rarely ask for permission before becoming accusations. As Officer Walker walked up the front path with measured confidence, several neighbors instinctively paused what they were doing. Conversations faded. Lawn mowers went silent. Even the birds seemed quieter for a moment. Nobody understood why a routine Saturday morning suddenly felt different, but everyone sensed that something ordinary had just crossed paths with something that was not. Daniel slowly closed the legal journal and rested it beside his coffee without making any sudden movement. His expression remained composed, the kind of quiet confidence that often came from years of patience rather than pride. As Officer Ethan Walker reached the bottom step leading to the porch, he stopped for a brief moment and looked across the yard as though searching for confirmation that he was in the right place. His hand rested near the radio attached to his uniform, while his eyes studied every detail of the property. The freshly painted porch railings, the neatly trimmed hedges, the family photographs visible through the front window, and the small bronze plaque mounted beside the door that simply displayed the house number. Nothing appeared unusual, yet something in his posture suggested he had already reached a conclusion before speaking a single word. Daniel offered the same courteous greeting he would have given anyone who approached his home. "Good morning, officer. Is everything all right?" His voice was calm, steady, and respectful. There was no trace of irritation, only genuine curiosity. Officer Walker did not return the greeting. Instead, he looked directly at Daniel and asked, "How long have you been sitting here?" The question sounded less like conversation and more like an interview. Daniel glanced briefly at the coffee that had already cooled beside him before answering honestly. Maybe 30 minutes. It is a beautiful morning. The response did not seem to satisfy the officer. His eyes drifted toward the street, then back to Daniel, as if trying to fit the peaceful scene into a different story already forming in his mind. Across the road, Mrs. Henderson straightened from her flower bed, sensing that the exchange had become unusually tense. Young Mason stopped pedaling his bicycle and quietly watched from the sidewalk. One by one, nearby neighbors began noticing that the conversation was lasting longer than expected. Daniel remained seated, neither defensive nor intimidated. Years of experience had taught him that calm often revealed more about a situation than anger ever could. "May I ask what this is about?" he said politely. Officer Walker folded his arms. "We receive a report about a suspicious individual matching your description sitting around this neighborhood for quite some time." Daniel looked around at the quiet street before gently replying, "Officer, I live here." His answer was simple, almost matter-of-fact, delivered without sarcasm or frustration. For a brief second, silence settled between them. It seemed like the moment when a misunderstanding could easily be resolved with a single question or a quick verification. Instead, Officer Walker took another step closer. "Do you have identification with you?" he asked. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, I do. My wallet is inside the house. I can retrieve it if you would like." Again, the answer came without resistance. Again, the opportunity to de-escalate quietly presented itself. Yet the officer's expression remained unchanged. Rather than acknowledging Daniel's explanation, he continued scanning the porch as though expecting to uncover evidence supporting the report he had received. Daniel noticed the growing number of neighbors observing from a distance, some pretending to continue gardening while others stood perfectly still. He understood how quickly appearances could shape opinions before facts ever had a chance to catch up. Still, he refused to let anxiety dictate his words. He kept both hands visible, maintained steady eye contact, and waited patiently, believing that professionalism would eventually replace assumption. What he could not know was that every passing second was allowing a simple misunderstanding to grow into something the entire neighborhood would remember for years. Officer Ethan Walker slowly reached for the handcuffs secured to his duty belt, his movements deliberate, almost routine, as though he had already decided how the encounter would end. Daniel Brooks noticed the gesture immediately, but his expression did not change. He remained seated for another moment before standing carefully from the rocking chair, placing his coffee mug on the small table beside him. "Officer," he said in the same calm tone, "I am willing to cooperate. If you would like identification, I can retrieve my wallet from inside my home." His voice carried neither fear nor defiance. It was simply the voice of a homeowner trying to resolve an uncomfortable misunderstanding with patience. Officer Walker shook his head before Daniel could take a single step toward the front door. "Stay exactly where you are." The words were firm enough that several neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Mrs. Henderson quietly stepped away from her flowers, her gardening gloves still in her hands. Across the street, another resident lowered his newspaper, sensing that something ordinary had turned unexpectedly serious. Daniel slowly nodded. "That is fine," he replied. "I will remain right here." For several seconds, neither man spoke. The quiet neighborhood suddenly felt unusually still, as if everyone were waiting for someone to say the one sentence that would return the morning to normal. Instead, Officer Walker looked over his shoulder and spoke briefly into his shoulder radio before directing his attention back to Daniel. "Place your hands where I can see them." Daniel calmly lifted both hands to chest level with his palms open. "Like this?" he asked politely. "Higher." Daniel immediately complied without hesitation. There was no argument, no sudden movement, and no raised voice. Every action reflected cooperation. Yet the officer continued watching him with visible suspicion, studying every motion through the lens of assumptions that seemed impossible to erase. Daniel glanced briefly toward the growing crowd of neighbors. Some had quietly taken out their phones, uncertain whether they were witnessing a misunderstanding or something far more troubling. A young mother, standing near her mailbox, gently pulled her daughter closer, not because Daniel appeared dangerous, but because the tension itself had become unsettling. Daniel returned his attention to Officer Walker. "May I ask what information you received?" he said respectfully. "Perhaps there has been a mistake." The officer answered without softening his tone. "Someone reported a suspicious individual lingering around private property." Daniel looked at the brick house behind him and gave a small, almost puzzled smile. "This is my private property." Again, the explanation hung in the air, offering another opportunity for the conversation to end peacefully. Instead, Officer Walker took another step forward. "Turn around," he instructed. Daniel blinked once, surprised but still composed. "Officer, with respect, I have answered every question you have asked. I have offered identification, and several of my neighbors can confirm that I live here." Mrs. Henderson finally spoke from across the lawn. "Officer, he has been our neighbor for years." Before anyone else could add another word, Walker raised one hand slightly, signaling for everyone to remain back. Daniel noticed the concern spreading across familiar faces. He also noticed something else. Nearly every person watching expected him to become angry. Instead, he quietly lowered his eyes for a brief moment, took one slow breath, and chose restraint once again. Sometimes dignity was not demonstrated by winning an argument. Sometimes it was revealed by refusing to surrender composure when someone else had already decided who you were before ever learning your name. Daniel slowly turned as instructed, keeping his movements measured and deliberate, making certain there could be no misunderstanding about his willingness to cooperate. The morning breeze continued to stir the maple trees lining the street, but the peaceful sounds that had filled the neighborhood only minutes earlier had vanished beneath an uncomfortable silence. Everyone watching seemed to understand that the situation had crossed an invisible line. Officer Ethan Walker stepped behind Daniel and secured the handcuffs around his wrists with practiced efficiency before guiding him a few steps away from the front door. Daniel did not resist. He did not argue. He simply stood on the front walkway of the home he had owned for nearly 2 decades, looking across the street at familiar faces now frozen between disbelief and uncertainty. Mrs. Henderson pressed a hand against her chest. "Officer, this cannot be right," she called out carefully. "He lives there. We all know him." Another neighbor, Thomas Reed, who had spent years coaching the local youth baseball league with Daniel, stepped onto his driveway. "There has to be some mistake," he said. "You should at least let him show you his identification." Officer Walker briefly turned toward the gathering residents. "Everyone needs to stay back while I complete my investigation." His words carried the confidence of someone convinced that procedure alone justified every decision already made. Daniel remained remarkably calm despite the growing attention surrounding him. "Officer," he said quietly, "my identification is still inside my home. If you would simply allow me to retrieve it, I believe this misunderstanding can be resolved in less than 1 minute." The request was reasonable. Even several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks, wondering why such a simple solution had not already ended the encounter. Instead, Walker replied, "You will remain exactly where you are until I determine your identity." Daniel nodded once. "Very well." He lifted his eyes toward the porch where his coffee still rested, untouched beside the open legal journal, now fluttering gently in the breeze as loose pages shifted one after another. The sight almost seemed symbolic. An ordinary morning had been interrupted before he had even finished a single cup of coffee. Across the street, more residents quietly emerged from their homes. Curtains moved. Garage doors opened. Cell phones appeared, not out of excitement, but because people increasingly felt they were witnessing something they might later struggle to explain. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed forward. The entire neighborhood seemed suspended between confusion and concern. Daniel noticed the cameras, but never acknowledged them. Instead, he focused on maintaining the same calm posture he had carried from the beginning. Years of experience had taught him that composure often spoke louder than emotion, especially when others had already formed conclusions. A black sedan turned slowly onto the street before continuing past the growing crowd. Daniel watched it for only a brief second. The driver appeared to search house numbers before continuing around the corner. A few moments later, Daniel's cell phone, still resting on the small table beside the rocking chair, began to ring. The sound echoed across the quiet porch. It rang once, then stopped. Seconds later it rang again. No one answered. Walker glanced toward the phone, but made no effort to retrieve it. A minute later it rang for a third time. This time the caller left a voicemail before the silence returned. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. Whoever was calling rarely called twice, much less 3 times in rapid succession. Somewhere beyond this peaceful neighborhood, someone was beginning to realize that a man who was never late had unexpectedly failed to arrive where he was expected, and that absence was quietly setting an entirely different chain of events and emotion. Daniel remained quietly on the front walkway while the morning continued moving around him as though 2 different worlds now occupied the same street. One world belonged to the neighbors who could not understand how an ordinary Saturday had become so unsettling. The other belonged to a schedule, unfolding many miles away, where every passing minute carried consequences that no one standing in the cul-de-sac could yet imagine. His cellular phone rang again on the porch, vibrating gently against the wooden table before falling silent once more. A moment later, a second sound joined it. From inside the house came the faint chime of a grandfather clock marking the next quarter hour. Daniel closed his eyes for only an instant. Time mattered today, not because he feared inconvenience, but because somewhere downtown a courtroom was preparing for a proceeding that depended upon his arrival. Officer Ethan Walker noticed none of this. His attention remained fixed on the report that had brought him there and the assumptions that continued to guide every decision afterward. Across the street, Thomas Reed quietly stepped closer to Mrs. Henderson. "This does not make sense," he whispered. "Daniel never causes trouble. He volunteers at the community center every month." Mrs. Henderson nodded without taking her eyes off the scene. "There has to be someone who can clear this up." As if answering her thought, another vehicle slowly entered the neighborhood. It was a dark gray sedan with government license plates, moving carefully through the residential street before slowing near Daniel's home. The driver looked toward the gathering crowd, checked the address on a printed document resting beside the steering wheel, then continued forward without stopping, disappearing around the corner as though searching for another place to turn around. Daniel watched the sedan disappear, but said nothing. His expression remained composed, although the smallest hint of concern crossed his face for the first time that morning. The phone rang again. This time the display illuminated brightly enough that even from several feet away the screen was visible. Multiple missed calls appeared beneath one another before the screen faded back to black. Nobody picked it up. Nobody checked the messages. The unanswered calls simply accumulated in silence. A gentle breeze turned another page of the legal journal resting beside the coffee mug, exposing handwritten notes in the margin before the page. Settled again. Nearby, Mason Parker quietly asked his father, "Why does everyone look so worried?" His father paused before answering. "Sometimes people do not have all the facts yet." The simple sentence lingered in the air. Daniel heard it and gave his slightest nod, almost as though he agreed completely. Facts had a way of arriving on their own schedule. They could be delayed, overlooked, or ignored for a while, but they rarely stayed hidden forever. Several miles away, inside a stately federal courthouse, attorneys were beginning to exchange uncertain glances as the scheduled start time drew closer. A courtroom deputy checked the hallway outside the courtroom once again before looking down at a watch with growing concern. A staff member quietly attempted another telephone call. It went directly to voicemail. "That is unusual," someone remarked. "He is never late." Back on the quiet suburban street, no one watching Daniel Brooks could have guessed that the unanswered phone resting only a few feet away connected 2 worlds that were now racing toward one another. And when they finally met, the assumptions made on a peaceful front porch would be measured against the undeniable weight of the truth. Inside the federal courthouse in downtown Washington, the atmosphere had begun to shift from routine confidence to quiet concern. Attorneys who normally focused on case files now glanced repeatedly toward the courtroom entrance. A courtroom deputy checked the hallway once again before speaking softly with the judicial assistant standing nearby. "Have you heard from Judge Brooks?" the deputy asked. She shook her head while looking down at her cellular phone. "I have called 4 times. Every call goes directly to voicemail." That answer alone was enough to draw attention. Daniel Brooks had built a reputation over many years for punctuality, professionalism, and respect for every person who entered his courtroom. If a hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, he was almost always seated and reviewing documents before anyone else arrived. The attorneys understood his habits well enough that his unexplained absence immediately felt extraordinary. One prosecutor quietly closed a file folder and looked toward defense counsel. "Has this ever happened before?" The older attorney slowly answered, "Not once that I can remember." Another member of the court staff hurried into the hallway, carrying a leather portfolio. "The United States Marshal Service has been trying to reach him as well," she explained. "Everyone is asking the same question." The concern spread quickly, not because anyone feared misconduct, but because Daniel Brooks was known as someone who honored every commitment. Meanwhile, several miles away, Daniel remained standing peacefully on the walkway outside his own home. Officer Ethan Walker continued speaking into his shoulder radio, requesting additional information while maintaining the same guarded posture. Daniel listened without interruption. He understood that emotions could cloud judgment, and judgment already appeared to be in short supply that morning. His cellular phone rested only a few feet away on the porch, its screen lighting up once again. This time a notification appeared almost immediately after another missed call. Then another. Then another. The vibration echoed softly across the quiet wood planks before fading into silence. Mrs. Henderson noticed the repeated calls and looked toward Thomas Reed. "Someone is desperately trying to reach him," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "That is not what worries me," he answered quietly. "What worries me is whoever keeps calling probably expects him somewhere important." At nearly the same moment, the dark gray government sedan returned to the neighborhood, this time moving even more slowly than before. The driver studied each house number carefully before stopping briefly at the end of the block. A second passenger examined a printed schedule, spoke a few words, and pointed back toward Daniel's address. The sedan remained motionless for several seconds before continuing forward again. Daniel recognized the vehicle immediately, although he offered no explanation and made no attempt to draw attention to it. He simply watched with the same measured composure that had defined every moment of the encounter. Around him, neighbors exchanged increasingly uncertain glances. The repeated telephone calls, the unfamiliar government vehicle, and the growing sense that something significant had been interrupted were slowly replacing certainty with doubt. The story that had seemed simple only minutes earlier was becoming more complicated with every passing moment, and without realizing it, everyone standing on that quiet suburban street had become witnesses to the final minutes before a hidden truth would step into full view. The quiet rumble of powerful engines finally settled over the neighborhood as 2 dark sport utility vehicles turned onto the street with deliberate precision. They were not marked with flashing lights, and they did not arrive with unnecessary urgency, yet their presence immediately changed the atmosphere. The gray government sedan that had circled the block moments earlier stopped near the curb, and several professionally dressed men and women stepped out, accompanied by 2 members of the United States Marshal Service. Their attention was not on the gathering neighbors or the patrol vehicle. Every eye moved directly toward Daniel Brooks. One of the marshals walked forward with calm purpose before stopping several feet away. He looked at Daniel first, then at Officer Ethan Walker, carefully taking in the unusual scene before speaking. "Good morning," he said evenly. "We are looking for Magistrate Daniel Brooks." The words seemed to suspend time itself. Officer Walker hesitated for the first time since arriving. His confident posture stiffened as though his mind was attempting to connect 2 completely different realities. He looked from the marshal to Daniel and back again, searching for some indication that he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Daniel met the marshal's eyes with the same composed expression he had worn throughout the encounter. "Good morning, Deputy Marshal Harris," he replied calmly. "I apologize for the delay." The marshal gave a respectful nod before glancing toward the handcuffs. His expression remained professional, but the surprise was impossible to miss. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "the courthouse has been attempting to reach you for nearly 30 minutes. Everyone is waiting." A quiet murmur spread through the neighbors gathered along the sidewalks. Mrs. Henderson lowered her hand from her mouth, her earlier certainty now replaced by stunned silence. Thomas Reed slowly shook his head, realizing that the unanswered telephone calls, the unfamiliar government vehicles, and the growing concern had all been pieces of a story no one had fully understood. Officer Walker swallowed and spoke for the first time in several long seconds. "Did you say?" "Magistrate." Deputy Marshal Harris turned toward him politely. "Federal Magistrate Daniel Brooks," he answered. "He is scheduled to preside over this morning's proceedings." The sentence landed with extraordinary weight despite its calm delivery. Daniel had never introduced himself by title. He had never attempted to use his position to influence the encounter. From the very beginning, he had simply offered to retrieve identification from inside his own home, answered every question respectfully, and remained patient while assumptions unfolded around him. The realization settled across the street one person at a time. The neighbors were not surprised that Daniel held an important position. They were surprised that he had never mentioned it. Officer Walker slowly looked toward the porch where the untouched coffee mug, the open legal journal, and the continuously vibrating cellular phone still rested exactly where Daniel had left them. Suddenly, every unanswered call, every government vehicle, and every quiet clue carried an entirely different meaning. What had appeared to be an ordinary investigation was now revealed as a profound misunderstanding built upon incomplete information. Daniel remained calm, his voice steady as ever. "Officer," he said gently, "I told you this could have been resolved with identification." There was no anger in his words, no satisfaction, and no attempt to embarrass anyone. Sometimes the strongest expression of dignity is not proving someone wrong. It is remaining faithful to the truth until the truth speaks loudly enough for everyone to hear. Deputy Marshal Harris exchanged a brief glance with his colleagues before speaking quietly with Officer Ethan Walker several steps away from the growing crowd. His tone remained respectful and measured, yet every word carried unmistakable weight. "We need to resolve this situation immediately," he said. "Magistrate Brooks is expected in federal court, and the proceedings have already been delayed." Officer Walker stood motionless for a moment, his earlier certainty replaced by visible hesitation. He looked toward Daniel Brooks, then toward the neighbors lining the sidewalks, many of whom had witnessed the entire encounter from beginning to end. Without another word, he carefully removed the handcuffs and stepped back. Daniel slowly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, not with frustration or resentment, but with the quiet composure that had defined every decision he had made that morning. He offered no harsh words and demanded no public apology. Instead, he simply looked toward the marshal and said, "Thank you for coming." The simplicity of the moment seemed to surprise everyone watching. Many had expected anger. Others expected confrontation. Instead, they witnessed restraint. Mrs. Henderson quietly wiped away a tear while Thomas Reed released a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. Around them, several neighbors lowered their cellular phones, understanding that what they had recorded was not merely an unusual police encounter, but a lesson about how quickly assumptions could shape reality. Deputy Marshal Harris walked onto the porch and retrieved Daniel's ringing cellular phone before handing it back with both hands. The screen displayed a long list of missed calls from court staff, judicial assistants, and government offices. Daniel glanced at the notifications only briefly before placing the phone into his pocket. "Please inform the courtroom that I am on my way," he said calmly. "I do not want today's schedule disrupted any longer than necessary." Even in that moment, his first concern remained the people waiting for justice rather than the inconvenience he had personally experienced. Officer Walker finally found his voice. "Sir," he began carefully, The words stopped before they could form a complete sentence. Daniel met his eyes without hostility. "Officer," he replied gently, "every decision carries responsibility. Today has simply reminded all of us why facts must come before conclusions. There was no bitterness in his tone, only quiet conviction. The statement lingered over the neighborhood more powerfully than any raised voice ever could. As Daniel prepared to leave with the marshals, another government employee approached carrying the leather portfolio that had been intended for the morning hearing. He handed it to Daniel with an appreciative smile. "The attorneys are ready whenever you arrive, Your Honor." Daniel thanked him and turned once more toward his home. His untouched coffee still rested on the small table exactly where the morning had been interrupted, now completely cold beneath the warming sunlight. The legal journal remained open to the same page, its corners gently moving in the breeze. For a brief moment, Daniel looked at the familiar porch with quiet reflection before walking toward the waiting vehicle. Behind him, the neighborhood slowly returned to motion, but nothing felt quite the same anymore. The peaceful street had become the place where assumptions met truth and where dignity had answered misunderstanding not with anger, but with unwavering grace. Several weeks passed before the neighborhood fully settled back into its familiar rhythm. Yet the events of that quiet Saturday morning continued to echo far beyond a single street. The official review followed established procedures, relying on body camera recordings, witness statements, dispatch logs, and every available fact rather than speculation. Daniel Brooks was never asked to explain why he had remained calm. His actions had already answered that question. Throughout the entire encounter, he had spoken respectfully, complied with every lawful instruction, and repeatedly offered the simplest possible solution. The record reflected those choices with remarkable clarity. For the neighbors who had watched everything unfold from their front yards, the experience left a lasting impression that reached beyond one individual or one profession. Mrs. Henderson later told friends that what she remembered most was not the confusion or the tension. It was the quiet dignity of a man who refused to let someone else's assumptions define his own character. Thomas Reed shared a similar reflection during a community meeting several days later. He reminded everyone that fairness begins long before courtroom. It begins the moment a person chooses to seek facts instead of conclusions. Daniel himself never discussed the incident publicly beyond the statements required through the proper process. On the following Saturday morning, almost exactly 1 week later, he returned to the same rocking chair on the same front porch. Another cup of coffee rested on the familiar wooden table beside the same legal journal, and the neighborhood slowly came to life around him once again. Mason Parker rode his bicycle past the house, this time stopping long enough to wave with an even bigger smile than before. Daniel smiled back and wished him a good morning. Mrs. Henderson crossed the street carrying a small basket of homemade blueberry muffins, insisting that no one should have to drink coffee without breakfast. They laughed together, not because they had forgotten what happened, but because life had continued with kindness instead of bitterness. Across the street, several neighbors paused to greet Daniel as they headed out for the day, each conversation reflecting the quiet respect that had always existed, now strengthened by a deeper understanding of the importance of patience and truth. Daniel looked across the peaceful neighborhood before lifting his coffee. The morning felt almost identical to the one that had been interrupted, yet something had changed in everyone who had witnessed those events. They had learned that appearances can be incomplete, assumptions can be costly, and dignity never requires an audience to remain meaningful. Somewhere downtown, another courtroom prepared for another day of serving justice under the law, while in a quiet suburban neighborhood, another lesson had already been written without ever appearing in a legal opinion. It had been written in ordinary choices, measured words, and unwavering composure. A badge represents responsibility. A title represents service. But neither one defines the value of a human being. Only character does. And sometimes the strongest voice in the pursuit of justice is not the loudest one in the room. It is the calm voice that never abandons truth, even when truth has not yet been recognized. Because respect earned through integrity will always outlast authority exercised through assumption. And on that peaceful street, everyone discovered that the law is strongest when it begins with listening before judging.